I need the pole shift to happen. Walter C. Wright's theory is that gravity is a push and works just like magnetism. Gravity is a repelling force, not an attracting force. Look at the solar system and imagine every body in the solar system as a magnet. The sun is the biggest and strongest magnet in the middle of the solar system. You can see that magnets have magnetic lines that curve out from their poles. The sun is doing the same thing, and these magnetic lines curve out across the entire solar system. Look at where the planets are positioned. Every solar system and planetary system has this disk shape. There are some orbits that deviate up and down a little, but overall the orbits all form this flat disk shape, even the galaxies themselves. Do you think that's by coincidence? If we draw the magnetic lines from the sun as we do from a magnet, you can see how the planets end up pinched between the south and north pole lines. Planets themselves are magnets that either produce their own magnetism or are magnetized by the sun's lines of magnetism. You can look at Jupiter's system of moons and you see the same thing. If gravity was just an attracting force, then why the disk shape to the solar system? Why aren't planets flying over the top of the sun and at any other conceivable angle? There are some dwarf planets at the very periphery of the sun's influence that have orbits that angle pretty high off the plane, but that's because these planets are at the periphery of the solar system and the sun's magnetic influence is very weak, and so they can manage to stray a little into the North Pole and South Pole lines of magnetism. The sun is pushing all the planets away from itself, and the planets push all the moons away from them. However, there is a residual pushing force produced by other stars and celestial bodies around the solar system that push in the other direction. The sun can only push away the planets so much before that same kind of force in the other direction cancels it out, leaving the planets trapped where they are. Where the planets end up in orbit around the sun also depends on their size and chemistry and how good of a magnet they are. The sun spins in place, and so does its magnetic field, which creates this carousel effect that drags all the planets around and around and around in their orbits and gives them a spin of their own. So, what happens during a pole shift on Earth? A pole shift does not have to be just the north and the south poles simply switching sides. We get told that the worst we'll get is the compass pointing in the opposite directions, and some earthquakes and volcanoes erupting and tsunamis. And it's true, those things will happen. But what they don't tell you is that the Earth will gain a new axis and a new equator. Just like when you push with a magnet on another magnet, and if they're set in a way that they repel each other, the other magnet will slide to reorient itself just by the push of the magnetic field of the magnet that's near it. So if the Earth's poles change position, the Earth or the planet will reorient itself to the sun's magnetic field. So the new poles end up as the new axis of the planet, and you get a new equator. Here are some videos talking about the ancient equator. How is it that all the ancient sites like the Egyptian pyramids, the pyramids in the New World, the Nazca lines, they're all lined up to follow a straight line, a line which very well could have been chosen by the ancients, because back then it was the Earth's equator. The poles can shift by 30 degrees or 90 degrees or anywhere in between. Do you think it's a coincidence the Earth's axis is between the magnetic poles? That the axis of every planet and moon is between the magnetic poles? If gravity is an attracting force, then it shouldn't matter where the poles are. The axis should remain unchanged. We're dealing with an awful lot of coincidences when we consider gravity as a pulling force. The coincidence of all the planets taking on this flat disk arrangement around the sun, the coincidence of them winding up in orbit in such a precarious balance that they can't fall into the sun, but can't fly away from it either, that their axes are all between their magnetic poles. Here, Walter Wright talks about the frozen woolly mammoths found in Siberia. Studies have indicated that these mammoths did not originate as Arctic animals, and they would not survive under Arctic conditions. They had parts of their last meal between their teeth and on their tongues, which apparently they did not seem to have time to swallow. The cells of the mammoth's body are preserved for thousands of years due to his being frozen. He died without any sign of violence. No one seems to know how these mammoths were quick frozen. It had to be a very tremendous cold in a very short period of time, or otherwise the center of the mammoth could have remained warm enough to allow decomposition to start. Mammoth steaks were taken to London and eaten by the Royal Society. These frozen mammoths have always been found on plains a little above sea level, but never in mountains. They found buttercups in their mouths, and buttercups will not grow at even 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and they will not bloom without long daily periods of sunlight. They were found to have been frozen 10,000 years ago by the radiocarbon dating method. Scientists believe that at some time in the past, either the poles were not where they are located today, or this area of the Earth's surface that lie about the poles now were someplace else at one time. Walter Wright's answer is that the mammoth was eating buttercups when the Earth gently tilted vertically in the area of 90 degrees, and the sun set on him suddenly, and the mammoth found himself in darkness. He was quick frozen, not knowing he was in the area of the North Pole, 8,000 miles from his old home at the old equator. The former polar ice caps, especially if they end up suddenly at the equator, would rapidly begin to melt, and the oceans will rise 200 feet. Now it makes sense why every ancient civilization has the story of the Great Flood. Here's what the Earth would look like after all the polar ice caps melt. California's Central Valley would become an inland sea, and you could have ships sailing there. And we could drive north and actually go to the beach. Do you think an inland sea in Central Valley might generate rain that will turn the scrublands into a forest? I need to have scrublands turned into a forest. The poles don't have to shift by a lot, maybe 20 or so degrees, enough so Antarctica is no longer on the South Pole, and then you get to watch all the ice rapidly melt. This guy thinks he found what might be a future North Pole. If the poles shifted 90 degrees, that location in Brazil could possibly end up at the North Pole. The Earth will reorient itself to the new axis and a new equator, and California will be almost right on the equator, and it will become tropical. Not only will there be an inland sea in the Central Valley, but the Sea of Cortez will connect with the Salton Sea. I have nothing to lose from a pole shift and everything to gain. Why do you think the establishment lies about what really happens when the poles shift? A big part of it has to do with their phony climate change agenda. All of the world's fresh water is slowly being locked away inside the ice at the poles. Walter Wright said that if we don't want droughts, we should be melting the ice caps artificially. In fact, if the Earth doesn't have a pole shift, it may eventually become as dry as Mars, as all the water becomes locked in ice. I guess it's because the ice caps don't melt as fast as they grow. So it's only natural that all the lakes and rivers will dry up as the amount of liquid fresh water diminishes. What do the global warming fanatics tell us? That the worst thing would be for the polar ice caps to melt? No, it would actually be a good thing if they melt. Liquid water gives life. If you don't want deserts to spread and forests to die out, you want more liquid water circulating on the planet. So, do you see how moot your climate change concerns become? If the planet reorients itself and gains a new equator, all the climate zones will be reshuffled, and there will be mass extinctions, and there's nothing you can do about it. And you not driving a car in California and taking the bus instead won't mean fucking shit. It's all a fraud. And if people understood what really happens during the pole shift, they'd give up on this global warming bullshit because it means nothing. Yet the tribe needs the global warming excuse to enslave us and push things like the UN Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. Another thing is, what does the pole shift mean geopolitically? A 90-degree shift will cause some tropical countries to become frozen hellholes in a matter of days. There will be mass starvation. And how many people at the equator own clothing that will allow them to survive Arctic temperatures? What do you think happens if Brazil becomes the North Pole? People there will flee in panic toward what will become the new south direction, and they won't care about national borders. China is spreading its influence into Africa to a point where it's like China is colonizing Africa. If China ends up right at the new South Pole, the only way they could survive is to have places in Africa. Africa may have been lucky enough to never end up as one of the North or South Poles, or otherwise the Negroes would have been extinct by now. And so it was always pretty much oriented at the equator. So the Homo erectus species never found itself in the cold and never had to evolve a bigger brain in order to become smart enough to survive in the cold. But the Neanderthal species in Eurasia were, for a time, probably living in Siberia when it was tropical, and then when the world moved and Siberia became cold, those Neanderthals had to use intelligence to survive and ended up evolving higher intelligence than the Homo erectus. One would think that every nation would be trying to figure out how to redraw their borders and how to divide up land that will shrink significantly due to flooding, and how will the countries that end up in the locations of the new poles survive, and what to do with Antarctica. The elites don't want anyone there right now. The UN has pretty much claimed it for itself. So who is going to use the nice new continent that will become habitable after the pole shift? And Antarctica had to have been habitable in ancient times before the pole shift. So it makes one wonder what archaeological wonders of ancient civilizations could be trapped under the ice there. Coal has been found in Antarctica, so it had trees growing there at one point. Walter Wright said that he is more surprised the pole shift didn't occur yesterday. And he said this back in the 1970s. I would benefit from the pole shift by acquiring a better climate. If California moves south, it becomes tropical. And if it moves north, it becomes like Seattle. And if it ends up on the equator, it becomes tropical. So in all those cases, I will gain a forest. I don't give a fuck that all the coastal cities will be flooded or that people will die. However, I am so unlucky that this will not happen in my lifetime. It could happen tomorrow, or another 1,000 years might pass before it happens. However, there are encouraging signs that we could be nearing a pole shift, and that's a good thing. Everyone should have an attitude that they will personally survive the catastrophe, and it's mostly other people that they don't like who will die. The academia believes that the pole shift causes massive crustal displacement, where the continents just slide over many thousands of miles, which is bullshit, when it makes much more sense to imagine planets as magnets and gravity as a repelling force, and like magnets, they reorient themselves so their poles are always in an up and down position in relation to the sun.